I think everyone who sets out on their first journey through the lands between is overwhelmed by the game's world and atmosphere. Even though so little is explained and so little is revealed about the major characters, it still feels as though everything is connected and there's a deeper meaning behind it all. When you think about it, it's actually incredible that Elden Ring continues to captivate the community even though almost 4 years later there's still no clear understanding of the backstory of the lands between. Some people even claim by now that there isn't a backstory at all. Others argue that the story is simply made up of countless loose ends. Only a few still believe there's an underlying narrative that truly explains all of the strange details in Elden Ring. I'm absolutely convinced that such a backstory does exist, one that explains almost all of those details and that we can, in fact, uncover it. In this video, I want to share my perspective on the lore of Elden Ring. I also discuss how, in my view, the game's content was designed, and finally how one can piece together the underlying story. Since release, people have exchanged countless ideas, theories, and bits of information across Discord, Reddit, and YouTube, but an all-encompassing theory, one that truly feels like it cracks the story, still hasn't emerged. The discussions have evolved over the years. In the first 1 or 2 years after release, the focus was primarily on collecting and organizing information in text form. But since that information alone couldn't answer all the game's questions, the theories became increasingly speculative. There were high expectations for the DLC and above all, hope that it would finally address some of the community's biggest questions. I personally found the DLC incredibly impressive, but I was also a bit disappointed that it barely answered any questions about the lands between, and in the end even raised new ones. Like many others, I expected to learn more about Godwin, for example. The following kept bothering me. In an interview, Miyazaki made it fairly clear that Shadow of the Earth Tree would be the only DLC and that the story was therefore essentially complete. I couldn't understand how Shadow of the Earth Tree could possibly bring Elden Ring's story to a conclusion. Was this really all the information we were going to get? What was Miyazaki thinking? I just couldn't wrap my head around it. The theories and discussions on Discord, Reddit and YouTube grew more and more speculative as people still tried to understand the lore. But when you look around on YouTube and dive into these so-called theories, you realize that much of what's said is poorly supported. The discussions fade away, and in the end, the story remains a mystery. Something must have escaped our notice. How could Miyazaki be satisfied with concluding Elden Ring with Shadow of the Earth Tree? Could it be that the issue lies in the community's overall perspective and approach itself? So let's rethink everything from the ground up. As is known, everything began with a story, a myth, written by George R.R. Martin. It started when Miyazaki made contact with George R.R. Martin. They exchanged various things and probably enriched each other greatly. Let us get an overview of George R.R. Martin's influence by looking at excerpts from interviews with Miyazaki. Miyazaki tells us the following about George R.R. Martin's contribution in the interview of the Overture. Compared to your previous games, what about Elden Ring stood out as new and different to you as a director? There are two major things in particular. For one, this time around, we were collaborating with George R.R. Martin. We asked him to come up with the mythologies that form the underlying basis of Elden Ring, events that took place in its world well before players step into the story. Building a game up from an existing backdrop like that was a new experience for me, and it was a thrill to break that ground. You previously mentioned freedom as a keyword for Elden Ring. Would you say there was more creative freedom for the enemy designs this time around? The enemies have certain characteristics to their design that are unique to Elden Ring, especially the crucial boss characters. Most of the major bosses are demigods that appear in the mythology that George R. R. Martin wrote for us, so they were designed with a careful eye toward giving them an appropriately mythological, heroic feel. Of course, since we are FromSoftware, that's heroic in a rather broad sense of the word. They are heroes of ages past, since subject to the ravages of time, loss, disgrace, corruption, transformation, aberration, but heroes all the same. It sounds like George R. R. Martin's mythology is a real core part of the experience. It certainly is, but that mythology is the initial spark, so to speak. With such a great well of inspiration to draw from, we were ready to come up with our own ideas and build them into the boss characters you'll face in Elden Ring. I'm extremely grateful to Mr. Martin for allowing us that approach. Also, since we had Mr. Martin's mythology to work with, most of these major bosses ended up being more talkative than usual. I don't mean to say they are a bunch of chatterboxes, but compared to the bosses in our past games, they have noticeably more dialogue. That's a simple difference, but I think it's refreshing. In an interview with Edge magazine, Miyazaki tells us more about his collaboration with George R. R. Martin. What memories stand out from your first conversations with George R. R. Martin? Yes, I have some good memories of those initial discussions. Not so much for the content, but just the general feelings I had speaking with George Martin. He actually knew about the Dark Souls games. He was aware of them and what they were about, so that made me happy. That sort of gave me a little bit of a boost. I knew immediately from talking to him, it just became apparent his skill and his passion for the fantasy genre, and for games as well. There was a little bit of a generation gap between us, so I felt a bit apprehensive about going to these talks, but after a lot of these conversations, it was just like speaking with an old friend. And it just felt so fresh to have those conversations with someone who was so passionate about the same things, and to show that pure joy and sense of curiosity for these fantasy worlds. This was something that really captured my interest throughout all of our talks, and I was really thrilled to be working with him. What were the environments for the initial meetings that took place? It was usually going to Marika and to his hometown or base of operations. I think it was a hotel where we first sat down and spoke. It was us going out to him, to his home turf, and having these kick-off conversations with him there in person. What can you tell us about the creative brief you gave him before he set to work on the foundational parts of Elden Ring's backstory? Early on, we established a very good level of respect between each other, both in our personalities and the sort of work that we do. And this was really important in establishing that foundation for the game, because Mr. Martin respected the fact that we didn't want him to write the game's story or the in-game text, because we felt like that would actually limit his creative output, and if it was limited to something that was already a game or already a concept in this way, then it would limit the inspirations we could possibly get from him. So we established very early that he would be writing that foundation, that historical element to the game, something that took place long before the events of the game itself. In this way, he was able to much more freely flex those creative muscles and provide something that wasn't restricted. We started off by giving him these very vague and broad themes and ideas for the mythos that I had swimming around in my head, along with what kind of games we typically make, and this sort of themes we like to explore in our games. So it was all very loose and quite vague. Then he would come back to us with a lot of ideas. How about this, this, and this? That back and forth started the exchange of ideas. What form did his Elden Ring mythos take when it arrived with you? Short stories? Character sketches? There was nothing visual, it was all text. Rather than being a short story, it was something that depicted the setting or set the scene for the game and for the world, detailing the flow of history and the figures who appeared throughout it. There was, of course, a story that came with this as a sort of backbone, but it played as more of an introduction to that world and a natural course of events for these characters to follow. And this is what was given to me and the team. And then we were able to interpret this in our own way and provide the visuals to go along with that, and to build that into an actual game. A lot of the motives that came from this and drove my creative thinking behind these elements in the game were connections between people, including parent and child relationships. A lot of the issues that Mr. Martin dealt with in his writing provided these motives for the game itself, so that is something I'm very grateful for. What can you tell us about the character on the cover of this issue? When we were talking with George Martin, we had these themes and ideas for creating pieces of artwork for the bosses, for these core characters of the story. And when he wrote the mythos, we asked him to create these dramatic heroes of this ancient mythos that takes place before the events of the game. These dramatic and heroic characters weren't really present in our previous titles, so this is something that was really appealing to me, how he would depict the mystic and heroic qualities of those characters. And Godfrey, the character in your cover artwork, is sort of an embodiment of that. He's one of the major players in the game. One of the motivations of the player character in Elden Ring is to become Elden Lord. They are to journey to the lands between and become the next Elden Lord. In the sort of heyday of the Golden Order of the lands between, there were 2 Elden Lords, and Godfrey was the first of these. He was the very first Elden Lord and was married to Eternal Queen Marika, who's been detailed in some of the lore we've released publicly so far. And he was representative of this period of grandeur and affluence. He represents everything great about the Elden Ring and about the lands between at that time. Eventually, he was exiled from the lands between. He himself became tarnished, and he shares this deep connection with the tarnished, the player character. Godfrey is an embodiment of their long history and struggle. He represents a lot of what the player character stands for, and he symbolizes a deep connection with the player, something that used to shine brilliantly and has now become tarnished and fallen from grace. There are tentacle motifs across the blade of Godfrey's poleaxe, which suggests connection to the ocean. Is that a part of the world we can expect to navigate in the finished game? What I will say is that he's a character with a major presence in this story, and he represents not only a great part of the player character's role, but also a large part of the world and its history. And so, without spoiling too much, I just want to say, as a character that represents so much of the game, he's definitely one who I find very appealing and very attractive in that sense. And I think there's a lot to explore there for the players once they play the game, and they see the sort of presence he has, and they figure out how deep his tale goes. There were also interviews with Miyazaki regarding the DLC, in which he talks about the influence of George R. R. Martin. The following interview is from Famitsu. In the main story of Elden Ring, you depicted a heroic epic. Will that theme remain unchanged in the DLC? Yes, the theme of heroic tales will not change. The character Mesmer, shown in the key art, is an easy example to understand. He is also one of the heroes. The chair Mesmer is seated on is the same as the one found in the area where the player battles Morgoth, the Omen King, in the main game. He too is a being on par with Godric, Malenia, Radahn and Rykard, and is also referred to as one of Marika's children. Regarding the DLC story, is George R. R. Martin involved this time as well? Martin's involvement is unchanged from that of the main game. The world and story of the DLC were, as before, inspired and constructed from the mythos he wrote. More precisely, portions that were conceived during the main game's production, built upon ideas stimulated by his mythology, now form the basis of this DLC. Therefore, no additional writing was done separately for the DLC. In an interview with Wilkinson from Xbox, Miyazaki also gave answers on this topic. Regarding the collaboration with George R. R. Martin, can you further explain how this collaboration came about and in what role it has served throughout the project? The actual collaboration itself began with Mr. Martin ever so politely confirming what sorts of themes, ideas, as well as many game-related aspects I had envisioned for the game. This allowed us to have many free and creative conversations regarding the game, in which Mr. Martin later used as a base to write the overarching mythos for the game and world itself. This mythos proved to be full of interesting characters and drama, along with a plethora of mystical and mysterious elements as well. It was a wonderful source of stimulus for me and the development stuff. Elden Ring's world was constructed using this mythos and stimulus as a base. Even I myself find it hard to contain my excitement from time to time. We hope that everyone else is looking forward to the world we have created. And then there's also an interview with Famitsu about Elden Ring. So Mr. Martin didn't directly build Elden Ring's world, but rather wrote its foundational material? Yes, it would be more accurate to say that he constructed the mythological foundation upon which the world of the game is built. We knew from the start that he was extremely busy, and we weren't aiming to make a game driven by a rigid linear story, nor did we want to bend his creative vision to fit the needs of our gameplay. In other words, you didn't want this to be the sort of RPG that simply follows a preset storyline. Exactly. For those reasons and intentions, the proposal became, would you write a myth set far in the past? Something that would serve as the premise and foundation for the world of our game? Are there aspects of the world that wouldn't have existed without Mr. Martin's participation? Yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. The mythology Mr. Martin wrote for us was incredibly compelling, mysterious, layered, and filled with dramatic characters whose stories were built upon tangled bloodlines and complex relationships. It functioned as a mythology, but also as history, even as epic poetry. It gave us a kind of creative stimulus we had never experienced before. In summary, we obtained the following information from the interviews. The underlying foundation of Elden Ring's story is the myth written by George R. R. Martin, which was created after extensive discussions between the two. They exchanged ideas and various themes that the story would address or incorporate. The myth not only establishes historical elements and describes the setting of the world, but also provides a foundational narrative concerning the main characters. This myth includes many of Elden Ring's key figures such as Marika, Godfrey, and the demigods. Many of the motives contained within the myth revolve around relationships between characters, for example, mother-child relationships. Miyazaki describes the main characters as dramatic and heroic. The myth presents a complex fantasy drama interwoven with bloodlines. And the myth also served as the basis for the DLC, Shadow of the Earth Tree. Based on this, we can assume the following. There exists a myth that contains a complex fantasy drama between the main characters of Elden Ring and ultimately explains the events in the lands between. This myth serves as the foundation for Elden Ring and its accompanying DLC, Shadow of the Earth Tree. If there really is a story in the form of a fantasy drama, how does Miyazaki intend to tell it if he doesn't tell it directly? Even after becoming Elden Lord and finishing the game, it's still hardly clear what kind of person Marika actually is. And what about Godfrey? Judging from Miyazaki's description, he sounds like one of the most important figures in the myth. Yet in the game itself, little is known about him and we only see him briefly near the end in connection with a boss fight. George R. R. Martin's fantasy drama is scarcely visible in the game. How exactly does Miyazaki tell his stories? Does he even give us the possibility to reconstruct the backstory? Let's take a look at a few excerpts from interviews in which Miyazaki talks about his way of storytelling. In a 2018 interview with Sony about Sekiro, there are also responses from Miyazaki regarding his narrative style. Changing gears, what's your philosophy when it comes to the idea of lore versus story? The former being focused on world building within the game, the other the act of actually telling a story. There are some aspects of Sekiro that will be different than our previous games, and others that will be similar. In Sekiro, the story is actually centered around the main character. He's a character in the story who exists in this world. Previously, we had nameless characters who weren't as involved. Thanks to making the main character part of the story, at the beginning of the game is probably easier to understand than our previous games. Aside from that, not too much is different. This isn't a game where you go through one area, kill a boss, watch a cutscene, and the game tells you where to go next. The story trickles in as you are playing the game. You will find things that will give you more information on the world, the lore if you will, along with actual story information as well. In that way, it's similar to our previous games. Is there a particular reason you choose to tell your stories this way? Do you find that it's a more effective way of storytelling? I'm a fan of stories that require you to use a little bit of your imagination in order to really understand the whole thing. When I was young, I used to enjoy reading books that were too hard for me, where I could only read maybe half the kanji, and using my imagination to fill in the gaps. I wanted to see if I could bring that kind of experience to a video game, where you use your imagination to bridge those gaps. In 2022, Miyazaki gave another interview with Sony about his storytelling, this time also concerning Elden Ring. In what ways have Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice impacted your philosophy on developing Elden Ring? I'd have to say that, considering Sekiro's development overlapped with Elden Ring's to an extent, there's nothing that directly came through from the project. But there were several indirect examples there. For instance, the enemy stance break mechanic in Elden Ring is similar to Sekiro's successful posture system. We even referenced Sekiro's player traversal for the horse mounting system and how you traverse the map in Elden Ring. Also, in terms of the narrative and how we tell character stories, Sekiro was a lot more direct than our previous Souls-like titles. While we are still maintaining Elden Ring's world with a sense of depth and a fragmented narrative, we are still upholding our storytelling philosophy. There's more focus on human elements and drama than before. We definitely took some inspiration from how Sekiro handled that and tried to apply the good parts to Elden Ring. In the Famitsu interview about the DLC Shadow of the Erdtree, there were also responses from Miyazaki regarding his way of telling stories. In terms of user experience, Elden Ring also tells its story and world in fragments, leading players to engage in their own interpretations and discussions about its lore and setting. Including Elden Ring, there are several reasons why I choose a fragmented way of storytelling. First, I want the gameplay experience itself to become the player's own story. That's why we don't present a tightly structured narrative in an explicit or talkative way. Second, I want to leave room within the story for the player's imagination. This ties back to the idea of the gameplay itself becoming the player's story, but also, quite simply, I think imagining what lies beyond the visible is a very enjoyable experience. There's also the fun of gathering the fragments and putting them together, having that moment of, so that's what it means, it all connects. The final answer in the Shadow of the Erdtree interview in particular makes it clear that Miyazaki provides players with the opportunity to piece together the background story themselves. Miyazaki does not tell a story in the classical sense, as most video games do. Instead, he wants us to uncover it through the various clues scattered throughout the game. However, he deliberately omits key pieces of information which we are meant to reconstruct through our imagination. He assumes that this is possible and that in doing so we may even experience moments of realizations when connecting the fragments. From this, we can derive the following assumptions. It is possible to infer the background story of Elden Ring through the information provided within the game. And Miyazaki does not convey the background story in the usual sense, but rather in the form of fragments that must be interpreted and pieced together with the help of imagination. Regarding uncovering the background story, Miyazaki said the following. There's also the fun of gathering the fragments and putting them together, having that moment of, so that's what it means, it all connects. I believe that Miyazaki intended to indirectly convey to us within the game itself that all the strange details and events can be connected. I call these dialogues, which Miyazaki wrote himself and in which I felt he was speaking to us, echoes of Miyazaki. It is Muriel who tells us something about learning, and in doing so, sounds almost like Miyazaki in the previously quoted interview.
Oh, what have we here? Very well, let us both learn together. Heresy is not native to the world. It is but a contrivance. All things can be conjoined.
Miyazaki already wanted to convey to us through Muriel that all the fragments in Elden Ring can be pieced together. It's not just about considering the literal meaning of the text. It is Rani who points this out to us and gives us confidence that a certain skepticism and persistence will pay off.
Quite the stubborn one, aren't we? Wise in a way. The lands between are home to lies and cheats aplenty. Perhaps thine ample mistrust will be to thy benefit.
I also had the feeling that even in Ymir's dialogue, it is Miyazaki himself who expresses that no one recognizes the brilliance of the connections and the lore behind it.
And yet, none can fathom its implications. Its utter brilliance.
One of the clearest hints from Miyazaki that there is a truth, an actually discoverable background story, can be found in the character creator. One of the templates is named Truth Seeker. The face of an All-Star pilgrim. There are many roads to truth. Miyazaki's statement that we must and should use our imagination at certain points to piece the fragments together clearly shows that this story cannot be understood solely through the literal meaning of text. This is precisely where the difficulty lies and why the background story of Elden Ring remains unsolved to this day. From my experience, the lore community mainly consists of two types of personalities. The first group are called naive readers, and they act like pedants. They believe theories should only be based on textual information and its literal meaning. They consider these as hard facts and accept only theories and claims supported by evidence. However, not only do interviews with Miyazaki make it clear that relying solely on the literal meaning of text information is not enough, but one also ends up with countless strange and unresolved details, an unclear timeline, and too many open questions about the world and characters. After the DLC, it should be clear that the pedantic approach is insufficient and not Miyazaki's intended method to uncover the background story. Miyazaki himself says he wants players to fill gaps with their imagination and piece them together. This means interpretations are necessary for connecting fragments, and there are no proofs for the crucial connections. The pedantic viewpoint of naive readers is doomed to fail because it cannot consider well-founded interpretations. The second group are called over-interpreting readers, and they act like conspiracy theorists. They use their imagination to create ideas that supposedly answer all questions, but hardly use any information from the game as a basis. They often make connections to themes outside the game world that are poorly justified and not convincing. With enough imagination, of course, anything can be imagined, but then how do you know if it's the actual background story? Theories without a basis in the game's information are equally unhelpful. Both the pedantic viewpoint of naive readers and the conspiracy theorist viewpoint of over-interpreting readers lead nowhere. In my opinion, the right approach and right perspective lies between these two. Alongside textual information and its literal meaning, we must also consider information in other forms that can be found in-game. Visual information, or so-called environmental storytelling, for example, requires a proper interpretation. People who follow this approach can be called interpretive readers. Interpretive readers consider textual information and other forms, striving to interpret them as best as possible with reasoned analysis. Discussions among interpretive readers revolve around comparing multiple plausible interpretations. If Miyazaki has implemented the fragments of the story in a way that requires us to use our imagination and interpret things, the question arises, in what way has Miyazaki hidden additional information in the game? There is an interesting part of the interview between Famitsu and Miyazaki about Elden Ring. Regarding the story that leads to the ending, will it, like Dark Souls, involve the player piecing together fragments to form the narrative themselves? Yes, that basic method of storytelling hasn't changed. But speaking only in relative terms, of course, I think the core aspects of the story are easier to understand this time. At the same time, the fragmented storytelling has grown broader and more multi-layered than before. By the way, do you personally oversee the in-game text? There's an enormous amount of it, so it's not easy, but I make sure to read through everything, and I personally write a significant portion of it as well. Miyazaki describes his storytelling as more multi-layered than in previous games. This means that the fragments exist in the game in various ways. Miyazaki has always had a passion for books, which apparently often served as inspiration during the development process of his games. In an interview about Dark Souls 3, Miyazaki said the following: "Where do you look for inspiration these days? Do you seek other games, movies, or books? Can you tell me about what you've been reading, watching, playing lately, and what's interested you about it?" My sources of inspiration come from various venues. The media you mentioned are sources of inspiration, but if I was to bring one item up in particular, I would say books, especially text-based books. I've brought this up before, but my pastime is to imagine and fantasize from reading text-based books. This is one of my inspirational sources towards game development. The approach has not changed, even regarding Elden Ring. Especially after an exchange and collaboration with George R. Martin, it is quite conceivable that Miyazaki primarily relies on stylistic devices commonly used in literature. Unfortunately, Miyazaki has never spoken in detail about exactly how he hides these fragments in the game, but from everything I have seen in the game myself, they often involve literary stylistic devices. Some of these have long been known to the community. Based on what has so far been considered consensus in the community and what I have personally observed in the game, I have identified the following stylistic devices for myself: parallels, irony, metaphors, symbolism, illusions through associations used in item placement, other forms of references and illusions, red herrings, and coding with colors, assets, and character traits. Let's begin with examples and the approach regarding parallels. In Elden Ring, there are even clues that allude to the concept of parallels in general. In several places in the Lands Between, we find a statue of a woman striking a very specific pose. Often she holds a spear, but this statue also frequently appears without one. It is the pose of this statue that contains the reference. This pose symbolizes the principle of as above, so below. It appears, for example, on the tarot card The Magician. The same pose also appears in connection with the myth of Baphomet, who is also depicted with this pose. In both cases, the principle of as above, so below is referenced. In real life, this principle concerns the idea that order on earth reflects the state of the heavens. Ultimately, in the context of Elden Ring, it simply describes the concept of parallels. The stories and connections of the minor characters mirror those of the main characters. The DLC Shadow of the Erdtree also contains a reference to this concept and emphasizes it again. This reference is found in the spell Fleeting Microcosm. The term microcosm alludes to the concept of microcosm and macrocosm, which conveys the same worldview as the concept of as above, so below, and is often associated with it. The analogy of microcosm and macrocosm is that small-scale relationships mirror large-scale relationships. This too attempts to hint at the concept of parallels and how they function. The following line contained in the spell Fleeting Microcosm I interpret as an echo of Miyazaki. The broken and discarded are fully willing to cling to fleeting simulacra, earning them some modicum of sympathy. Miyazaki appears here to want to convey that he sympathizes with those who try to piece together the story of Elden Ring using vague parallels or subtle microcosms. Events that have occurred similarly in the past represent parallels, known as event parallels. These can provide insights into connections or emphasize them more strongly. For example, there is the event with Blythe, who goes mad and theoretically should turn against Ronnie once she opposes the Two Fingers. It explains how shadows react if their Empyrean opposes the Two Fingers. From this event, one can infer what might have happened if Marika had once opposed the Greater Will. One could suppose that Marika went mad and turned against Marika. Another possible event parallel concerns the Harlech tree and the Earth tree. Gideon seems able to infer Miquella's condition from that of the Harlech tree, and that the Harlech tree's state reflects Miquella's state. From this, there might be connections between Radagon and the Earth tree. Radagon is in a broken state, and if the Earth tree reflects his condition, it must also be broken. In the We Are Godwin theory, I elaborated that the Earth tree's broken state is concealed by the golden Earth tree consisting of grace. The event parallel ultimately helped us better understand these connections. Another event parallel exists between Farum Azula and the Earth Tree. At the center of Farum Azula is a former Elden Lord wounded and imprisoned. The same circumstances are found at the heart of the Earth Tree, a former Elden Lord wounded and imprisoned. Just as stones and parts of the ruins of Farum Azula fall, so do the leaves from the Earth Tree. In both cases, it's about the decay of Farum Azula and the Earth Tree. Here we have an event parallel. If we assume that the side characters actually represent fragments of the main character's story, this would be a massive source of information barely tapped by the community so far. It would contain an enormous amount of information that could indeed shed light on the stories of Marika, Godfrey, and Radagon, and additionally serve somewhat as a solution. So, initially, I only worked with the assumption that minor characters reflect fragments of the main character's stories. The problem? Hardly any parallels are recognizable. This is exactly where the problem lies. I am firmly convinced Miyazaki and FromSoftware designed parallels as follows. In the stories of main characters like Godfrey, large parts are omitted. These untold story fragments are then implemented and told through minor characters as parallels. This means the parallels are hard to detect because they tell stories we don't know. This may sound like circular reasoning, but the results I have achieved with this assumption leave me no doubt that the parallels were designed exactly this way. If we assume all minor characters reflect the untold stories of the main characters, it all looks more like a puzzle. Which main character hides behind the minor characters? How do we find out which main character the parallel belongs to? And who exactly counts as the main characters? From here on, Everything initially follows the trial and error principle. One considers which main character a minor character might be a parallel of, imagines their story, and how it ultimately fits into the big picture. If, in the end, all minor characters together create a large overall picture and fit together, I see it as a sign that the assumed parallels are correctly assigned. If all parallels as a whole complement each other like puzzle pieces and this creates a clear overall picture, then we can assume it is no coincidence. The results I have obtained with this method are too good to be false. However, there will never be proof that one is right. The assembling of fragments works like a puzzle. Whether puzzle pieces belong together is ultimately recognized by the emergence of a large overall picture. There is simply no proof in a puzzle. The resulting overall picture should be convincing enough to justify this method. Let's look at the character Fia as an example. If we explore Fia's room, it is noticeable that paintings of Marika are prominently displayed there. Fia is also designed with blonde hair. These details most strongly evoke an association with Marika. Thus, it is suspected that Fia's story reflects Marika's story. However, when thinking about Marika, it is hardly clear in what way this parallel would make sense. Indeed, it requires an incredible effort searching in many other places for fragments of the story to eventually put all these puzzle pieces together into a recognizable whole. I have undertaken this effort and documented the results in my theory, We Are Godwin. It turns out that Marika, as the woman with the black hood, was the one who planned the Night of the Black Knives, tried to resurrect Godwin in the Chapel of Anticipation, was stopped, and ultimately had to sacrifice herself. The stories of Fia and the twin brothers Dee are thus recognizable as a parallel. Fia harbors a grudge against the Golden Order. Fia wants to resurrect Godwin. Fia organizes an assassination attempt on Dee. The sleeping Dee awakens and sets out to kill Fia. Dee ultimately kills Fia. Viewed as a parallel, it was Marika who harbored a grudge against the Golden Order, Marika who wanted to resurrect Godwin, Marika who was behind the Night of the Black Knives, Godwin who awakens in the Chapel of Anticipation and sets out to kill Marika, and it is we, as the resurrected Godwin, who ultimately kills Marika. Additional references that complement this parallel I have detailed further in my theory, We Are Godwin. I have spent an incredible amount of time trying to understand how these parallels are designed and have arrived at the following conclusions. The main characters around whom the actual story of Elden Ring revolves include Marika, Godfrey, Radagon, Godwin, Melina, and the Greater Will and the Elden Beast. The minor characters contain clues pointing to their associated main character through environmental details, dialogue, appearance, color coding, and etymology of their names. For those interested in my findings, I encourage taking a look at the following overview. I emphasize that these are not mere unfounded claims. I have invested significant time and effort into uncovering these parallels. Miyazaki and FromSoftware have even hinted slightly at the importance of parallels as an abstract stylistic device in Elden Ring. Ranni's dual face certainly holds multiple meanings, but I believe that among other things, it is meant to point to the concept of parallels. Ranni's doll represents the Snow Witch Renna, and she even introduces herself with that name when first met. It is quite possible that Ranni represents a parallel to Renna. and that Ronnie's story may reflect Renna's story. In the DLC, Miyazaki and FromSoftware also hinted at the concept of parallels in connection with the Carrion Princess. In Relana's cameo, it is stated, "Engraved as a reminder of the unparalleled devotion of those who left their homelands to serve Relana." I am certain that the description as unparalleled is an ironic comment. Interestingly, the icon of Relana's cameo actually depicts parallels. Here too, there is a general allusion to the concept of parallels in connection with the Carrion Princess. Parallels ultimately form an incredibly large source of information that, even 4 years after release, remains barely explored. I actually think everyone should know how irony works, yet I want to explain it again here. What's interesting is that irony is in fact considered a stylistic device in literature. I think the description in The Boiled Prawn and Boiled Crab, which reads, "Not that it matters, it's delicious all the same," contains hidden irony. The statement of the opposite is used to emphasize the true meaning. The claim that the description doesn't really matter serves to highlight that the boiled prawn and boiled crab do, in fact, possess a deeper meaning. In relation to the Knight of the Black Knives, Fia tells us,
Have you ever heard of Black Knife Prince? Dear Roger likes to talk of them when abed, and the ancient plot in which the first of the demigods was slain. The black knives wielded by the assassins who committed the act, along with the impressions they made, somehow hide the truth of the conspiracy. These grand affairs are hardly my forte.
She tells us that such grand affairs are not really her concern. And yet, she's the one who commits an assassination against Dee in a similar manner. Behind the line, "These grand affairs are hardly my forte," lies irony. The statement of the opposite highlights that Fia is, in fact, a person deeply entangled in precisely such affairs. The statement of the opposite highlights that Fia is, in fact, a person deeply entangled in precisely such affairs. It emphasizes that she mirrors Marika, who orchestrated the Night of the Black Knives. There's also an example of irony in Night Rain in the final chapter of The Duchess. In this chapter, the Duchess writes a letter to the Iron Menial. It reads, "To a dear friend who has always been true." In the We Are Godwin theory, it becomes very clear that the Iron Menial acts manipulatively. In the line, "To a dear friend who has always been true," there is irony. Once again, the opposite is stated to emphasize that the Iron Menial is anything but honest and in fact a great manipulator. Miyazaki and his team use ambitious meanings and double meanings and are often mixing up metaphorical and literal meaning to keep the lore vague and cryptic. One of the best examples is the intro scene where we walk through a fork rift and then find ourselves in the Chapel of Anticipation. Some believe we wake up outside the lands between and teleport through the fork into the chapel. However, it is more likely the fork symbolizes re-entering the world of the living and awakening. Miyazaki appears to focus on the metaphorical and symbolic meanings rather than the literal, which often serves mainly to create ambiguity. Elden Ring is filled with content that can be interpreted in multiple ways, making interpretation one of the greatest challenges in decoding the lore. Miyazaki, however, seems to have had a particular interpretation in mind, but keeps it vague enough to allow many possibilities. Metaphors are sometimes used to highlight and convey specific concepts. One such metaphor is the sword and whetstone metaphor. The whetstone symbolizes authority and power in Germanic cultures, as it represents the leader's control over the clan's weapons like swords. Just as the whetstone sharpens clan members' swords, the leader inspires his clan. In the We Are Godwin theory, this metaphor is discussed in the context of Night Rain and is shown to be present not only there but also in the main game. The whetstone knives and blades bear the script of the language of light, which Miyazaki uses because this language influences or even manipulates others. Just like the whetstone sharpens swords, the language of light from the Greater Will influences the tarnished. Many elements in Elden Ring carry metaphorical meanings, and it appears Miyazaki and FromSoft often design game content based on metaphors. Another example is the prisoner metaphor mentioned in the Beast Crest Heater Shield. There it says, features a beast as its crest, serving to remind warriors not to succumb to the arousal of battle. Fight with passion, but become not its prisoner. In this metaphor, someone is not described as a prisoner in a literal sense. Instead, someone who succumbs to the madness of fighting and thus loses control over themselves is described as a prisoner. Someone who is not master of themselves is metaphorically compared to and portrayed as a prisoner. One place in the game where this metaphor is applied is Vaike's Everjail. The actual meaning behind the two existing versions of Vaike is that he has succumbed to madness. Since he is no longer master of himself, his original self is, in a metaphorical sense, a prisoner. The use of symbolism is similar to that of metaphors. While metaphors make comparisons, symbols are used to represent other objects. For example, the dragon heart contains the following description. Dragon heart seized by a dragon tracker. Riddled with gravelstone, this grotesque organ continues to beat vivaciously. An offering used in the dragon communion. Consume a dragon's heart at the altar to make its power yours. While a terrible and savage-looking thing, the heart has a peculiar beauty to it. By consuming the dragon heart, one gains the powers of the dragon. The heart itself still beats, thus it is portrayed as living. Behind this is a metaphor. Consuming the dragon's heart metaphorically represents absorbing the dragon's soul. In this metaphor, the heart symbolically stands for the soul. This symbolism is also applied elsewhere. In my theory, We Are Godwin, I was able to clarify the symbolism behind the scorpion symbol and the scorpion charms. In the scorpion kite shield within the game, the scorpion is defined as a symbol for surprise attacks or assassinations. It states, emblazoned with a yellow scorpion, a warning of surprise attacks and sudden strikes. In the We Are Godwin theory, it later became clear that the scorpion charms carry the following symbolic meaning. The scorpion emerging from its exoskeleton, clutching a heart between its claws, symbolically represents Godwin during the Night of the Black Knives, who escapes with his soul, leaving behind only an empty shell. In the We Are Godwin video, I provide a more detailed and comprehensible derivation of this. The depiction of a crucifixion is symbolically associated primarily with punishment, but also with sacrifice. Interestingly, both Marika and Godfrey are depicted as crucified. From this, one can consider how the themes of punishment and sacrifice might fit into their stories. The design of the flask of crimson and cerulean tears includes a golden chalice. The portrayal of a holy golden chalice in connection with healing powers apparently references the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail myth attributes incredible healing powers to it, even granting eternal youth. Thus, the design of these flasks symbolically alludes to the Holy Grail and emphasizes immense healing powers. The theme of eternal youth even fits the item description, which also mentions rejuvenation. Another classic symbol is the snake. Often seen as a symbol of cunning and betrayal, in the game it is also linked to blasphemy, which is about betrayal of the divine. For example, the Lord of Blasphemy, Rykard, was thematically designed with a snake or serpent as a symbol of blasphemy and betrayal, which further accentuates his character traits and views. Miyazaki and FromSoft do not place items entirely randomly. In some places, it is clearly visible that items are thematically placed. For example, we find a scarab with the incantation Poison Mist near a poisonous swamp. In combination with environmental details, placed items can even tell small stories. In Leonia, for example, we find the jellyfish shield near a broken cart. Around it are 4 red glowing spirit jellyfish. Red glowing spirit jellyfish are aggressive and attack immediately, usually requiring you to attack first. The scene could be interpreted as follows. The broken card represents an accident. The jellyfish shield a dead spirit jellyfish. And the 4 red glowing spirit jellyfish are upset because of the dead spirit jellyfish. The connections are only hinted at, and it is up to us to interpret them. Even the smallest items were often thematically placed. In Stormvale, for example, there is a corridor with explosive barrels. Under these barrels, 3 smoldering butterflies are placed. When entering the corridor, a commoner throws fire pots at us, causing the barrels to explode. The number 3 is considered a bad omen according to the foretold Foulfoot description. So the 3 smoldering butterflies can be interpreted as a small allusion to the circumstances in which the nearby commoner might surprise us with a fire pot and explosive barrels. Perhaps the most significant location is the Sage's Cave. According to my theory, an incredibly large number of chests were placed here to emphasize that every item has important meaning. From inside out, the items tell the story of how Godwin survived the Night of the Black Knives. At the end of the cave, we find a Black Knife assassin and the item Concealing Veil, providing the context of the Night of the Black Knives. The next chests contain the Raptor Talons and 4 Dragonwound Grease. The Raptor Talons have 4 blades, referencing the number 4. Opposite are 10 golden great arrows with Crystal Cave moss in front of the chest. These items tell the story of 46's sacrifice and Godwin's escape as the flightless bird from the Golden Order. Matching the Raptor Talons are the skeletal mask and Raptor's black feathers near the Necromancer Garrus. These 2 armor pieces represent Godwin's abandoned corpse. The nearby Necromancer Garrus is dressed red, carries the Prince of Death staff, and uses the weapon Family Heads, representing 2 children and his wife. This part tells the story of Radagon and his desire for Godwin, who leaves only his empty corpse behind. During the Night of the Black Knives, 3 characters in some way died: Godwin, Ranni, and Marika. While Godwin fled and Ranni freed herself from her body, Marika also died, her soul returning to Radagon. The next room contains several Those Who Live in Death, a bonfire, and a stone sword key behind an illusion wall. The story here remains undeciphered for now. Further along, 5 silver-pickled fowl feet, a black hood, a candle tree wooden shield, and a nascent butterfly are found. These items tell the story of Marika, the woman in the black hood who prophesies Godwin's resurrection and contacts Miquella. A crucial reason Marika saw no other way but to shatter herself and the Elden Ring was that Radagon uncovered the events of the Night of the Black Knives. There is a reference to this as well. In Stormvale, just before reaching the grotesque visage, a spell related to this is found. Rancor Call, Sorcery of the Servants of Death. summons vengeful spirits that chase down foes. Charging enhances potency. Once thought lost, this ancient death hex was rediscovered by the necromancer Garrus. The rediscovered spell of Necromancer Garrus to summon vengeful spirits ultimately serves as a reference or allusion to the fact that Radagon discovered what truly happened during the Night of the Black Knives. This seems to be the reason why this spell is placed precisely in this corridor. The final items in Sage's Cave are 5 rejuvenating boluses and lost ashes of war. These tell the story of Godwyn's resurrection without memories. As you might have noticed, the references and allusions, such as those recognizable in the Rancor Call, form a network that extends all the way to Stormvale. When it comes to item placement, FromSoft is using different items as references and is playing charade with us. They are using the associations that these items evoke to create recognizable references. There are several other ways in which Miyazaki and FromSoft create connections. Items or locations are encoded through colors and assets. This is done to highlight a link or a shared trait. In addition to encoding with numbers or the quantity of items, things are also coded through colors, assets, or even character traits. In my theory We Are Godwyn, for example, I have found that the color combination of gold, black and turquoise is always associated with the theme of resisting death. The Deathblight basilisks are designed in this color combination and can apparently live despite being infected with Deathblight. The same applies to the Deathblight crabs. In these, the color turquoise is even further emphasized. For some reason, the Deathblight mist of the crabs is turquoise. The rejuvenating boluses also possess the color combination of gold, black and turquoise. These ultimately even cure one of Deathblight. Even on Godwyn's corpse, the color turquoise is present. In the end, it was the colors in the sky of Limgrave, after we received from Melina the flasks of crimson and cerulean tears, that made us wonder whether all this is a coincidence or another hint that we are Godwyn who survived the battle against death. Regarding other connections, the color combination of white and purple seems to be associated with Marika as the woman in the black hood. Marika as the woman in the black hood is represented by the statue in the catacombs, which ultimately contain Glowthwort and Grave Violet, which we associate with Marika. That exactly these colors were chosen for the flowers in the 4th Church of Marika is certainly no coincidence. The colors emphasize that Marika is the woman in the black hood. Here, clues from various formats complete the overall picture. That Marika as the woman in the black hood was the one who wanted to resurrect Godwyn is emphasized not only by the white and purple flowers. The 4th Church of Marika is also guarded by mausoleum soldiers. And additionally, we find the Eclipse Crest heater shield with a direct view of the 4th Church of Marika. In the We Are Godwyn theory, I have also discussed the eclipse as a symbol for Godwyn's prophesied resurrection and Sellen as a parallel to Marika. It could also be that the 4th Church of Marika is symbolically meant to represent great luck, as it is coded with the number 4. Assets are also used to establish connections between different locations. Especially when they are relatively rare, one should examine them more closely. An example of such usage can be seen in the Lower Capital Church. There lies a green carpet with an interesting pattern on it. This type, pattern and color do not exist anywhere else in all of Leyndell. This should make one think. In fact, this pattern is found exclusively on items associated with the Golden Lineage. In Stormvale, we find some green banners with the same pattern, which also additionally bear the line as a symbol of the Golden Lineage. Elsewhere, there are also red variants, which also bear the line Zerosh as a symbol. This is confirmed in the description of the tree and beast surcode. We also find the same patterns on the Banished Knight's shield, which also carry the lion Sarosh as a sign of the golden lineage. Getting an overview of all placements of this pattern, one can see that it is always associated with the golden lineage. From this, one can think about why we find such a pattern in the lower capital church. In a similar way, one can also examine the red carpet with the rare symbol in the Church of Stormvale. This asset is also relatively rare and most commonly found in this church, emphasizing its connection to the Church of Stormvale. In my theory, We Are Godwin, we ultimately found that all these locations are connected to the circumstances of Godwin's resurrection and contain hidden references. One of the carpets can be found in the Cliff Bottom Catacombs, where we have found both the Nox mirror helm and a statue of the woman in the black hood holding a book. This statue is also rare and networked with further references. The theme of the Cliff Bottom Catacombs revolves around Marika's plan regarding the Knight of the Black Knives. Additionally, the carpet is found in Fortified Manor and Roundtable Hold, in the two lower side corridors. Hidden references here include Nephilim, who has lost her guidance from Gideon. Nephilim parallels the banished Godfrey, who was also part of the conspiracy of the Knight of the Black Knives. Interestingly, two different paintings referring to Marika who shattered herself are placed in this corridor. In the other corridor, we find the painting Flightless Bird and a corpse in a bed with the cipher Pata, representing Godwin's escape from Langdell during the Night of the Black Knives, sleeping in the Chapel of Anticipation until awakened by the Erdtree Grace, and a message from the Elden Ring as we identified in We Are Godwin. Moreover, in Fortified Manor, there is a room upstairs decorated with paintings of Marika and bookshelves, further emphasizing Marika's plan in some way. Apart from these locations, a faded version of the symbol is found in the lower capital church. Together with items from Leonel and Fia and the green carpet linked to the golden lineage, this also represents another emphasis of the references. The yellow carpet with the faded symbol of the Church of Stormvale further emphasizes that all the references relate to Godwin's resurrection in Stormvale. And curiously, the portal next to Fia also leads us to such an altar with a yellow carpet and the faded symbol of the Church of Stormvale. Here again, using items and environmental details, the resurrection of Godwin is hinted at. The detailed description of these elements is explained in the theory We Are Godwin. There are indeed two more of these red carpets in Castle Anzus, but I will discuss and explain the references behind them in videos about Marika. Finally, the asset of a canopy also forms a good example, as this depiction is found only in two places in the entire game, in the icon of Baldachin's Blessing and Radiant Baldachin's Blessing, as well as at the 4 belfries. This emphasizes the parallel between Marika and Fia, and that Godwin slumbers in the Chapel of Anticipation. A further method to recognize parallels is to pay attention to character traits. Miyazaki and FromSoft appear to encode parallels with character traits. Parallels can sometimes also be recognized based on the portrayal of the character. A good example of this seems to be Alexander. Alexander is portrayed as an experienced warrior. From him, we also receive as a reward at the beginning Exalted Flesh, which is also associated with the warrior clan of Godfrey. But one hint that is especially hidden in his dialogue becomes apparent at the very end of his questline.
Then let us begin.
I am the great Jar Warrior, Iron Fist Alexander.
Alexander is glad to be able to die fighting a worthy opponent. At that moment, he laughs and rejoices.
All vessels are destined to one day break. But the great Alexander lived as a warrior to his last.
If the parallel to Godfrey is not yet clear, then a cut voice line of Godfrey would have made this even stronger. Godfrey also had a voice line in which he begins to laugh at the end.
Now I fight as Horaloo. Warrior! Brave, tarnished. Thy strength befits a crown.
Possibly this voice line was cut to make the parallel less obvious, or it simply did not fit into the overall image of Godfrey's portrayal. In Night Rain, weapons and skills were specifically chosen for the tutorial. They serve as an excellent example of how character traits are worked with. I claimed that the first two weapons are meant to create an association with Godfrey and Marika. Looking more closely, even more character traits can be recognized than I previously highlighted in my video. The two-headed axe is definitely a symbol of the golden lineage and Godfrey's weapon of choice. Earth Shaker is a skill also used by Horaloo. And even the improved charge attacks are a trait apparently closely related to Godfrey. It is Godfrey's icon that increases the damage of charged attacks. I think it becomes clear here that these skills and weapons were not chosen arbitrarily. Miyazaki and FromSoft used character traits to evoke associations. These can be anything from weapons, buffs, character traits, or other properties. If one pays very close attention to dialogue, one also discovers hidden allusions. For example, I claimed that the Guardian and the Raider represent parallels to Godfrey. The Raider tells us the following.
I wasn't much of a pirate, but out at sea every man who toiled by my side was my brother.
The Raider is portrayed as a pirate, but he claims that he's actually not a real pirate. The Guardian uses a halberd, but he tells us that he's actually not used to fighting with halberds.
I've trained with halberds before. No expert by any means, but I can hold my own.
In both cases, it is about the fact that it is actually Godfrey as the parallel. Godfrey was not a pirate, but a warrior, and as I will show in my next series, he never actually left the lands between. The Guardian, on the other hand, alludes to the fact that Godfrey actually fights with a two-headed axe and not with a one-sided axe that resembles a halberd. The Recluse also has a very interesting dialogue line.
Can the hound be taught a new trick, I wonder?
Have you ever wondered what she means by that? The Recluse represents a parallel to Marika as the woman with the black hood, and it is about tricking Radagon as the Leal Hound with the Knight of the Black Knives. Another stylistic device used both in literature and in movies are red herrings. The term red herring stands for the following. Red herring, a clue or piece of information that is or is intended to be misleading or distracting. In crime novels or thriller movies, red herrings are often used to initially mislead the viewer onto a false trail. Often, one of the characters is framed as the murderer, but in the end turns out to be innocent. It is often someone inconspicuous at the end. Similarly, Miyazaki and FromSoft also use red herrings. These involve situations where a certain interpretation is strongly suggested, but also contains a subtle alternative interpretation. The subtle alternative interpretation is in this case the one that ultimately helps in solving the lore. Of course, there is no proof of which interpretation is ultimately correct. A possible example would be the reaction of Fia if we attack her. When we attack her, she says,
Godwin, is that you, dear?
Since apparitions are emanating from Godwin's corpse at the same moment, there are two possible interpretations. Most would interpret Fia's statement as speaking to Godwin's corpse from which the spirits flow. The possibility that she is asking us if we are Godwin would make no sense to most. In my opinion, it makes more sense that Fia is addressing us since we are attacking her, and according to everything I have laid out in the We Are Godwin theory, it no longer seems unlikely that she might mean us. Perhaps the mere possibility that she means us should prompt us to think, could Fia actually be referring to us?
Godwin, is that you, dear?
Even the mending rune of the Death Prince could be interpreted in different ways. Most assume it is called the mending rune of the Death Prince because Fia wishes to rebirth Godwin's life energy within it. In the We Are Godwin theory, we considered whether it might be called that only because Fia and everyone else were unaware of what was truly happening inside Godwin, and that it was Voltsex who enabled Godwin's soul to escape. However, the name Mending Rune of the Death Prince also makes sense from the perspective of the We Are Godwin theory, as the Mending Rune inherits our, meaning Godwin's, life force. That is what Fia says.
And I will bear a child who will inherit your warmth too.
In the DLC, Shadow of the Earth Tree, there is interestingly a situation that also contains a second possible interpretation that includes us as Godwin. It is the situation in which Miquella appears.
Lord Brother, at long last you are returned. Tarnished one, aspiring lord of the old order, if you have known sin, if you grieve for this world, then yield the path forward to us. To I, Miquella, and my promised consort, Radahn.
Although Miquella mainly speaks to us in this sequence, most assume that he is addressing Radahn with Lord Brother. According to my We Are Godwin theory, it was Miquella who was supposed to wait for the resurrection of Godwin in Marika's place. Moreover, Miquella addressed Godwin as Lord Brother in the description of the Golden Epitaph. Accordingly, we could also interpret this cutscene as Miquella actually addressing us. Miquella recognizes Godwin in us, the one he has actually been waiting for all along. Another possible hint could be the sky, because the sky here appears in the colors gold, black, and turquoise, the same colors we had already associated with Godwin and our resurrection in Limgrave in the We Are Godwin theory.
Lord Brother, at long last you are returned.
All of these are possible interpretations, but ultimately we will never get proof of which one is correct. In any case, I am convinced that in all of these cases, there is an illusion that we are the resurrected Godwin. There are also red herrings elsewhere. I announced in the We Are Godwin theory that behind the paintings there are information and references that the community has not yet worked out. In the We Are Godwin theory, I showed that the 4 paintings, Prophecy, Resurrection, Homing Instinct, and Flightless Bird, tell the story of Godwin's escape and our journey throughout the game. The remaining 3 paintings also contain much more information than everyone thinks. These paintings deal with a champion, a sorcerer, and a red mane. In Champion's Song, Volcano Manor is depicted, and the item reward refers to a champion who is fallen to blasphemy. Because of this, most first think of Rykard. In the Sorcerer painting, a moon is depicted and the item reward mentions Renala, so most first think of her. And in the Redmane painting, Redmane Castle is depicted, and of course, one immediately thinks of Radan. What if I told you that all these associations are red herrings? These three paintings contain much deeper alternative interpretations about other characters. The Champion's Song painting is actually about Godfrey. The Sorcerer painting is actually about Marika, and the Redmane painting is actually about Radagon. How I came to this conclusion and what stories lie behind it, I will explain in future videos, but until then, I leave it to you to consider what clues are hidden in the paintings and the item rewards. The following article is about Miyazaki and an interview regarding Dark Souls 3. First of all, yes, there is a perfect storyline in my head. Miyazaki laughs right away when I ask about the title's narrative design, which continues to be light on dialogue and cinematics, but heavy on in-world flavor text and very purposeful map design. However, he's quick to add, I have no intention at all of enforcing that storyline to the players out there. Only those storyline elements that actually make it into the game are something that I need to force players to accept as a base for building up their own interpretation of the world. There are things in my head that aren't in the games, after all. So after that, it's all up to the players. I have no intention in forcing any of the storyline upon any of the players out there, and there will be no official statements made about the true story of the game. Even though this reflects Miyazaki's stance regarding Dark Souls, we have already learned from interviews that Miyazaki's and FromSoftware's approach to designing Elden Ring is the same as in their previous games. Therefore, it can be assumed that these statements also apply to Elden Ring. When Miyazaki is asked questions about the lore in interviews, but the lore itself is meant to be a mystery and a puzzle, we cannot expect him to simply give us the answers. Many people in the community tend to treat Miyazaki's statements about the lore topics as facts. But think about it. If the lore is truly meant to function as a puzzle, then the answers we receive from Miyazaki will only be superficial. He will respond with a surface-level interpretation, one that may appear to address the question to some extent, but will certainly not reveal the true story. What this means is that when it comes to specific lore questions, Miyazaki's statements should not be considered a reliable source. The best example of this is probably Night Rain. The following is what the game director Ishizaki from FromSoftware has said about Night Rain. Does the lore of Night Rain tie into the stories of Elden Ring or Shadow of the Erdtree, or even a possible Elden Ring 2, or is it completely standalone? We'd like fans to think of Night Rain as an Elden Ring spin-off, first and foremost. This story is completely separate and parallel to the world of Elden Rings. If you had to tie it in some way, we had the events of the Shattering in the original game. After the events of the Shattering, this is a completely separate branch of the Elden Ring story. We understand that there's a great deal of emotional attachment to the story of Elden Ring that a lot of the fans have, so we didn't want to encroach on that too much. We wanted it to coexist with the existing story, and for players both familiar and new to enjoy both of these stories separately. So does this mean that George R. R. Martin has no influence on Night Rain's story or world? That's correct. In another interview with Famitsu, he says the following. Does the setting of the world of this game and its story share anything with Elden Ring? It is a parallel world. What it does share with Elden Ring is the Shattering War occurred long ago in the lands between. Words and elements will also appear, but otherwise it is a separate story. Therefore, the mystery of Elden Ring's story will not be revealed. We did not want to distort the way users feel about Elden Ring's story, and that's why we have made it completely separate on purpose. The problem with a puzzle like the one in Elden Ring is that revealing the solution would only distort the way the players feel about its story. Imagine if it came out that the community had hardly discovered anything in the last 4 years. The community's interpretations likely differ greatly from Miyazaki's own. If FromSoftware were to tell us outright that the characters are meant to represent parallels, only a very small portion of players would actually understand it, since the concept of parallels is rather abstract. For that reason, they would never voluntarily reveal the solution to the puzzle. It's something we, as a community, have to work out for ourselves. However, Ishizaki may have given a small hint when he said that the story is parallel to that of Elden Ring. In both interviews, he deliberately used the term parallel. This could indeed be a subtle allusion. In my theory, I have so far discussed only the Wilder in detail and demonstrated that he represents a parallel to Godwin. But I can assure you that I've already identified all the other characters and their respective parallels, and they align perfectly with the story of Elden Ring. From this, I draw the following conclusion. Direct questions about the lore are not answered with reliable statements from FromSoftware. They might be insightful, but should be taken with a grain of salt. If they were to reveal the solution to the lore puzzle that no one has yet solved, it would only distort the way the players feel about Elden Ring's story. The community must work out the solution to the puzzle on its own. Be it the main game of Elden Ring, the DLC Shadow of the Erdtree, or even Night Rain. The underlying foundation in all these cases was, in my opinion, ultimately the myth of Marika, Godfrey, Radagon and their story. Within the community, people have primarily tried to interpret the game's content from a historical perspective. They wondered which architecture belonged to which people or era. Textures were data mined and studied in detail, and many drew on possible inspirations from the real world in order to interpret connections and reach conclusions. This perspective assumes that Elden Ring was designed primarily for immersion, meant to draw the player into the cultures of its world. Although Elden Ring's world feels incredibly fascinating and immersive, it occurred to me that Elden Ring was not actually designed to be immersive. The greatest problem within the community, and the reason the lore remains unsolved to this day, in my view, lies in its perspective on the game's content. Elden Ring's design is not primarily about specific cultures or historical correlations. In one of the previously shown interviews, Miyazaki himself said it. Everything began with various themes around which the story should revolve. I believe that Miyazaki and FromSoftware used George R. R. Martin's myth as the foundation, but more importantly, drew inspiration from the themes and motives contained within it. I imagine FromSoftware's creative process as follows. The starting point is Martin's story about Marika, Godfrey, Radagon and the others. From there, the team examines which themes or metaphors are associated with each character. Let's take Miquella, or rather Centrina, as an example. Miquella's or Centrina's role was ultimately to wait for the sleeping Godwin to awaken. This part of Miquella's story centers on the theme of deep sleep. Inspired by this theme, items and other game elements were designed around it. This is where the creative process takes place. Starting from a chosen theme, new content is freely created artistically. Only at the very end are the items furnished with immersive lore details. Another example is Godwin's escape from Lane Dell during the Night of the Black Knives. In the underlying story, one part deals with Godwin's escape, his passage through death, his flight to Stormvale, and his helpless fall into a deep sleep. In the end, he's only revived after an eternity and through fortunate circumstances. From this story, he becomes known as the Prince of Death. Elsewhere, Godwin is interpreted as a flightless bird sleeping helplessly in the Chapel of Anticipation. The number 4 is defined by FromSoftware as a sign of great fortune. Thus, The story of Godwin's escape from Leyndell to Stormvale on the Night of the Black Knives involves the Prince of Death, the flightless bird, and the element of fortune tied to the number 4. The recurring themes here are death, birds, and fortune. From there, the creative process begins anew, and game content is designed based on these themes. It was these very themes that ultimately led to the design of the Ravenmount Assassins. In Stormvale, we find the Claw Talisman. The design of the Ravenmount Assassins contains the themes of death, birds, and fortune linked to the number 4. Only afterward is the lore of the Ravenmount Assassins added, creating the illusion of immersion. The Ravenmount Assassins are not directly tied to Godwin, but their design was inspired by his story. FromSoftware then uses items associated with the Ravenmount Assassins to reference Godwin's story, as we see for example in the Sage's Cave. The Claw Talisman highlights the shared themes and links to Stormvale, once again evoking Godwin's story. Even the skill, Raptor of the Mists, where one vanishes into the fog and reappears later, fits the themes of Godwin's story. It was chosen for the Ravenmount Assassins precisely because their entire design draws from that part of the story, his disappearance and later return through the fog to confront Radagon. Sometimes it is not just themes but also metaphors that shape the design of characters. In the foundational story of Elden Ring, it seems to involve a character who succumbs to frenzy or madness and ultimately loses his own self. Alongside the theme of madness, the prisoner metaphor also appears here. This theme and metaphor inspired the design of Vaig, who succumbed to madness and lost control over himself. His true self thus remains only as a prisoner. To fall into madness is to become a prisoner of oneself. The imprisoned older version of Vaig is inspired by the prisoner metaphor and should be seen as a symbolic or metaphorical representation. This approach even seems to apply to the design of certain locations. Fort Lythe is a good example of this. It is a fort that in itself has no lore. The only interesting thing we find in this fort is the Fire Scorpion charm. In the We Are Godwin theory, we have observed that circumstances exist in Fort Lythe that can be associated with Rykard's role in the Night of the Black Knives. This concerns a spirit escaping unnoticed from the forces of the Earth Tree, leaving behind only an empty chest. These circumstances can be associated with Rykard's role in the Night of the Black Knives, where he helped summon Godwin as those who live in death. Through this, Godwin was able to escape unnoticed as the Prince of Death, leaving behind only an empty corpse. The story of Godwin's escape and the intent to reference Rykard's role were the basis for the entire design of Fort Lythe. FromSoft possesses the story of Godwin, his escape, and Rykard's role. FromSoft intends to integrate this in the form of parallels and references in the game and designs Fort Lythe accordingly. FromSoft creates almost everything in form of parallels and content inspired by the true story, which is never directly told. To reconstruct the story, we must try to trace this process backwards. The first step is about finding the right perspective. It's about looking behind the facade of immersion and recognizing references, allusions, and connections on a meta level. This is where the community is stuck. So far, very little has been discovered about Marika, Godfrey, and Radagon because the community has been unable to see through the facade of immersion for almost 4 years now. After recognizing the references, allusions, and connections on the meta level, it's also a matter of assigning these themes and connections to the main characters and ultimately reconstructing the story. Reconstructing the story that FromSoft ultimately leaves out is incredibly demanding. This incredible amount of detail and depth seems implausible to many. How can a game contain so many mysteries? I want to point out that it is entirely possible for Elden Ring to have such depth. The creative process of designing game content in this way requires much less effort than the reverse process of reconstructing the omitted story. One could imagine it like this. George R. R. Martin, Miyazaki, and FromSoftware experience and create a story about Marika, Godfrey, and Radagon. We, as players, later encounter Miyazaki and FromSoftware. Miyazaki and FromSoftware continually share inside jokes about the story of Marika, Godfrey, and Radagon. Without knowing the original story, we are left completely confused and wonder what Miyazaki and FromSoftware are actually talking about all the time. These inside jokes are ultimately the game content inspired by the true story, containing references and allusions. Players who take everything literally, and whom I previously called naive readers and pedants, are unable to understand these references and allusions. The inside jokes make no literal sense, leaving one with a heap of questions. Only interpretive readers with incredible effort after countless inside jokes can develop a sense of what the original story looks like. Creating such inside jokes requires little effort if one knows the actual story. Reconstructing the story from the inside jokes, however, does. In the We Are Godwin theory, I explained how the particularly hyped and additional trailer for The Revenant contains a reference to the circumstances of Marika and Godwin. In this trailer, The Revenant resurrects the Wilder to the soundtrack Bring Me to Life. The Revenant as a Marika parallel and the Wilder as a Godwin parallel ultimately represent a reference to the circumstances in the main game. FromSoft seems to produce trailers very deliberately, and they occasionally contain references and hidden clues to certain connections. Ultimately, it is the true background story and thematic connections that inspire the content. For example, I previously explained how the prisoner metaphor influenced the design of Vaig and how the theme of madness and the prisoner metaphor were applied here. Interestingly, one of the trailers contained a reference to these connections. In the official launch trailer, there is a scene where a character with a prisoner set is depicted in the Frenzied Flame ending. FromSoft deliberately chose a character with a prisoner set because thematic connections exist here that influenced the story of Elden Ring. Like in the example of Vaig, it's about the connections between madness and the prisoner metaphor, which deals with the loss of the true self and control over oneself. Even in one of the very first teasers, there might be a hint to certain connections. In the E3 announcement trailer, released by the Bandai Namco Europe account, Marika and Radagon are shown at the moment of the shattering of the Elden Ring. Scenes keep switching back to the fight between Malenia and Radahn. The video description begins with the following words: "Unparalleled adventure awaits in Elden Ring." I believe that the use of the word unparalleled here is actually ironic, intended to emphasize the actual application of parallels. The switch between the events of Marika and Radagon and those of Malenia and Radahn indicates that there is an event parallel present. The fight between Malenia and Radahn and its outcome represent a parallel to the conflict between Marika and Radagon at the moment of the shattering of the Elden Ring.
The conqueror of the stars, General Radahn. And the blade of Mikkel and Malenia the Seventh. These two were the mightiest to remain, and locked horns in combat. there would be no victor.
It is Melania who harms herself and begins to bloom, just as Marika shatters herself and becomes the golden Earth Tree of Grace. It is Radahn who remains half-dead after the conflict, just as Radagon remains half-dead in the Earth Tree after the shattering of the Elden Ring. Thus, it can be seen that even in trailers, hints to connections are hidden. The backstory, its themes and connections are also used as the basis for the trailers. My perspective ultimately includes the following assumptions. Assumption 1. There exists a myth that contains a complex fantasy drama between the main characters of Elden Ring and ultimately explains the events in the lands between. This myth serves as the foundation for Elden Ring, its accompanying DLC Shadow of the Earth Tree and Night Rain. Assumption 2. It is possible to infer the background story of Elden Ring through the information provided within the game. Assumption 3. Miyazaki does not convey the background story in the usual sense, but rather in the form of fragments that must be interpreted and pieced together with the help of imagination. Assumption 4. Miyazaki uses stylistic devices such as parallels, symbolism, metaphors, item placement, environmental storytelling, and codings through colors, assets, and character traits to scatter references and interconnect them. Assumption 5. Direct questions about the lore are not answered with reliable statements from FromSoftware. They might be insightful, but should be taken with a grain of salt. If they were to reveal the solution to the lore puzzle that no one has yet solved, it would only distort the way the players feel about Elden Ring's story. The community must work out the solution to the puzzle on its own. Assumption 6. Even the trailers contain thematic connections that allow conclusions to be drawn about the underlying story of Elden Ring. The lore is designed as an incredibly vast puzzle and offers us, as a community, the ultimate challenge. Elden Ring contains an astonishing story with what are probably the greatest plot twists in the history of video games. Should we manage to truly unravel the story of Elden Ring, it would be something unforgettable. Miyazaki believes that overcoming great challenges leads to an even greater sense of accomplishment. It seems he applies the same philosophy to the lore itself, believing that if it takes years to be fully deciphered, the reward will be all the more meaningful. This perspective becomes clear, among other things, in the following interview of the Overture. Alright, last question. What's the part of Elden Ring that you hope players enjoy the most? There's one thing that's remained unchanged. Throughout all of my previous work, and Elden Ring as well, I want players to enjoy a real sense of accomplishment after facing down and finally overcoming adversity. Beyond that, I also want them to feel that sense of adventure I talked so much about earlier. The world of Elden Ring is vast and mysterious. Don't hesitate to explore it or over-prepare. Feel free to experience its dangers and riddles. Get to know its people and events, and take in its myths and legends. If fantasy fans are happy, I'm happy. Even after 4 years, the community has barely managed to uncover a fraction of the story, because in my opinion, it still lacks the right perspective. About a year ago, I believed I discovered the correct perspective and methodology, yet within the lore community, I mostly encounter misunderstanding. Some members of the lore community, and even moderators, feel so attacked in their position and point of view by this theory that a moderator with a personal issue with me even banned me from the Elden Ring Lore Talk subreddit and the official Elden Ring Discord. The "we are Godwin" theory does not yet answer all the questions, as it still doesn't cover everything. The puzzle is far from complete. In my estimation, the "we are Godwin" theory currently explains about 20% of the entire backstory. and most of what concerns Marika, Godfrey and Radagon still remains undeciphered. To all those who seek genuine answers, I warmly invite you to my Discord server, exchange your thoughts, discuss differing interpretations, and try to see the bigger picture. The true story of the lands between, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be for everyone. The following words, too, resonate within me like an echo of Miyazaki. The teachings of a group of spiritual seekers known as the Dryleaf sect, revealed only to those of worthy valor and character.